There's a voice inside your head. You know the one I'm talking about. It's the voice that wakes up with you in the morning, already chatting before your feet hit the floor. The one that tells you what to wear, what to worry about, what you should have said yesterday, and what might go wrong tomorrow. It comments, it complains, it replays, it dreams, it doubts. And here's the strange thing, that voice talks as if it's you. It says things like, I should have done better. I'm not good enough. I hope they like me. I'll never change. And over time, we start to believe it. We start to believe that we are that voice, that this constant inner monologue, this storyteller in our minds, is who we really are. But what if it's not? What if you're not the voice? What if you're the one listening? Pause right there. Let that land, because in that one question, who is listening, the entire illusion of the ego begins to shake. That simple act of stepping back, even for a breath, reveals something startling. There's awareness, silent, watching, always present, always still. Even when the mind is busy, something in you is just noticing. Have you ever been in a moment of deep stillness, watching the sunset, listening to the ocean, sitting quietly with someone you love, and felt that strange sense of I'm just here? No thoughts, no commentary, just presence. That right there is the gap between the voice and the listener. And Buddhism asks you not to believe in this, but to see it. To observe your mind like you'd observe a passing cloud, shifting shapes, drifting by, but never solid, never permanent. Because here's the truth most of us miss. That voice in your head, it's not the villain, it's not even the problem. The problem is we mistake it for the self. And once that happens, we begin to live in a story, a self-narrative built from memory, regret, fear, desire. A story that constantly says, this is who I am. This is what I deserve. This is what I'm missing. But who wrote that story? You. Or is it just a loop of old reactions, expectations, and conditioning playing themselves out? You see, Buddhism teaches that the self we cling to is not solid. It's not stable. It's a process, an ongoing pattern that stitches together isolated thoughts and feelings and calls it me. But here's the liberating part. If the self is just a pattern, you can stop feeding it. You can begin to observe it. You can learn to let it go. Because once you realize that you are not the voice, that you are the awareness behind it, you reclaim something precious. A space, a pause, a still point within the storm. And in that space there's freedom. Not the kind of freedom that shouts or fights, but the quiet kind, the kind that no longer needs to prove anything. The kind that simply is. This is where Buddhist insight begins. Not in philosophy, not in belief, but in direct, naked experience. In watching the storyteller and realizing you don't have to believe every tale it spins. And once you catch even a glimpse of that, the entire story of me begins to loosen its grip. Not disappear, just soften. Just enough to breathe again. Just enough to wonder. If I'm not the voice, then who am I? Let's look deeper. There's a part of your brain that never seems to shut up. It's always buzzing, narrating, comparing, analyzing. It replays arguments from yesterday, imagines tomorrow's failures, rewrites the past, and constantly pulls you into a fog of me, my story, my problems, my identity. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network, or DMN for short. You can think of it as the mind's autopilot. It kicks in when you're not engaged in any task, when you're lying in bed, walking alone, or staring out the window. And what does it do? It talks to itself, about you. But here's the shocker. This mental network, so central to our sense of being a self, may actually be the architect of the greatest illusion of all. Let's pause here. Have you ever watched your thoughts like clouds drifting across the sky? One thought says, I'm not good enough. Another floats in, what if they leave me? A third shouts, I should have done more. You're not thinking these consciously, they're just arising. So who's creating them? And even more importantly, who's hearing them? This is where ancient Buddhist wisdom meets cutting-edge brain science. The Buddha didn't use the term default mode network, of course. But over 2,500 years ago, he described a delusion, a fabricated sense of I and mine, held together by nothing more than clinging and habit. Today, scientists describe something eerily similar. The DMN activates primarily when you engage in self-referential thinking, thoughts about your past, your future, your self-image, your regrets. It feels like you, but in reality, it's just a network of neural activity spinning stories. In fact, studies have shown that when experienced meditators enter deep states of mindfulness, the default mode network quietly shuts down. The narration dissolves, time and identity collapse. What remains is pure awareness, still, alert and free from the burden of me. And that's the paradox. The more we believe the voice in our head, the more we suffer. The more we observe it with curiosity and detachment, the more we taste the freedom that Buddhism calls nirvana, the extinguishing of illusion. So, what is the illusion? It's the idea that I am the one thinking, that I am the voice. But let's run a simple experiment. Right now, try to predict your next thought. Did you manage to do it? Probably not. Because if you were truly in control, wouldn't you be able to decide what pops into your mind next? The truth is, thoughts think themselves. The voice speaks, but not from any solid center. It's a ghost in the machine. And the moment you stop identifying with it, you discover a radical insight. You are not your thoughts. You are the space in which thoughts arise. You are the silent witness, the observing awareness that has been there your entire life, untouched by content, unchanged by circumstances. This is why Buddhist practice doesn't try to silence the mind through force. Instead, it invites you to watch the mind, to become familiar with its patterns, to notice how the default mode network constructs me over and over again, and how fragile that me really is. With each moment of mindfulness, the illusion weakens. With each breath, the fog begins to lift, and something vast, quiet, and eternal begins to shine through the cracks. Have you ever noticed how quickly we go from simply seeing, hearing, or feeling to claiming it as ours? A sound arises, someone laughs behind you. Instantly, your mind races. Are they laughing at me? You feel a twinge in your back. Suddenly, you're thinking, my pain again. What's wrong now? Or someone compliments you and without a second thought, your chest swells a little. Yes, I am pretty smart, aren't I? We don't just experience things. We absorb them, tag them, label them, and then wrap them up with a shiny bow that says, mine. But how does this happen? How does a completely neutral moment, like hearing a sound, turn into a full-blown narrative about you, your value, your fear, your pride? The Buddha explained this with stunning clarity over 2,500 years ago. Let's trace this path, not with abstract theories, but with the exact mechanism by which the illusion of me gets built, moment by moment. It starts with contact. A form, a sound, a smell, a taste, a touch, or a thought comes into awareness. This is what Buddhism calls phassa, contact between the sense organ, the object, and consciousness. But contact alone doesn't yet create me. Next comes feeling, vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. If someone praises you, it feels pleasant. If someone insults you, unpleasant. If the room temperature is just. Fine, it's neutral, but even now, me hasn't appeared yet. Then comes perception, sanyanya. The mind recognizes the object. That's the sound of my name. That's a look of disapproval. That's a sign of success. And here is where the chain picks up speed. We go from simple recognition to mental formations. A letter 1E45 KH a macron R. Thoughts. Intentions, assumptions, judgments, and memories start to build. Why did she say that? This always happens to me. I'm never appreciated. And finally, consciousness is colored by all of this in tilde a macron letter 1E47. The loop is complete. The moment is no longer a fleeting experience. It has become part of a self, not just pain was felt. But I am in pain. Not praise was heard. But they respect me because I'm worthy. This is the chain reaction the Buddha referred to as dependent origination. P, a letter 1E6D, I C C, a S, a MUPP, a macron D. It is not merely philosophical jargon. It is the blueprint for how we suffer. Because the moment we weave experience into me, we plant seeds of attachment, craving, fear, and sorrow. If the sensation is pleasant, we crave to repeat it. If it's unpleasant, we resist, push away, and fight. And if it's neutral, we often miss it entirely, drifting into dullness or distraction. Each link in the chain builds a thicker wall between what's happening and who we think we are. And here's the most tragic part. We're so busy managing this illusion of me. We forget to actually live. But now imagine, what if we could see this chain as it's forming? What if we could recognize, a sound just arose. A feeling followed, a thought formed, but none of it is mine. Like clouds passing through the sky, they appear, shift, vanish. They don't belong to the sky, they don't define the sky. And you are not your clouds either. To live with that clarity is to begin to deconstruct the ego in real time. And here's the turning point. When you start to truly see how the self is stitched together out of passing experiences, you also realize it never truly existed in the first place. What if your greatest suffering was built on a misunderstanding, not a failing, not a flaw, but a simple, innocent misinterpretation of experience? And what if every moment, yes, this very moment, you had the power to stop the chain, to see instead of cling, to feel instead of react, to let the experience arise and dissolve without the need to make it about you? As we explore deeper, we arrive at the most radical possibility. If the self is a construct, then freedom is not the prize you earn at the end of the journey. It is what remains W. You've probably felt it before. That quiet moment when you pause, mid-thought, mid-rush, mid-life, and wonder, who am I really? You peel back the layers of personality, memory, ambition, trauma, and still, something slips through your fingers, like trying to catch the wind with your bare hands. This is where Buddhism shatters the mirror we've been staring into. What if the image looking back was never really there? What if the self we fight to protect, glorify, and perfect is just a collection of patterns, stories, and shadows, nothing more than a mirage? Let's begin with the metaphor that rattled even the most advanced minds in Buddhist history, the empty house. Imagine walking into a home. The furniture is arranged. The curtains sway in the breeze. The lights flicker. Sounds of life echo in every room. You'd swear someone must be living there. But you search every hallway, open every door, and no one is home. That's your mind. Thoughts arise. Emotions pass through. Decisions are made. But when you look for the owner, the solid identity making these choices, you find no one. The Buddha saw this with piercing clarity, and he didn't just theorize it. He sat under a tree and saw straight through the illusion. This insight is called anatta, or non-self. And it doesn't mean you don't exist. It means that what you think of as you is not fixed, permanent, or independent. You are a process, not a person. Here's the twist. Most of us live our entire lives defending a phantom. Every insult feels personal. Every success inflates a fragile balloon of ego. Every failure feels like a personal collapse. Why? Because we cling to the belief that behind our eyes sits a CEO, the controller, the thinker of thoughts, the chooser of choices. But neuroscience now agrees with the Buddha that CEO is a fiction. Modern studies of the brain's default mode network reveal that what we call the self is more like background noise. It's the brain rehearsing stories about the past and fantasizing about the future. But it's not a person, it's a loop. When you strip away this loop, even for a moment, through meditation, silence, or deep insight, something profound happens. There's still awareness, there's still experience, but there's no solid center, no I to own it. It's terrifying and liberating, because once you stop grasping at the I, suffering softens. Suddenly, there's no one to offend, no one to protect, no one to prop up. What's left? Just life. Raw, vivid, immediate life, without a narrator distorting the story. Think of a rainbow, it appears vividly. You can see it, feel wonder at its beauty, even point at it. But try to touch it and it vanishes. Try to hold on to it and it disappears. The self is that rainbow, beautiful, convincing, but fundamentally ungraspable. This isn't abstract philosophy, it has real, grounded consequences. When you realize no one is behind the curtain, you stop taking everything so personally. You stop defending every opinion like your life depends on it. You stop trying to find yourself in every relationship, job title, or Instagram bio. And in that space, peace grows, compassion deepens. You start to live not from the story of who you think you are, but from the presence of what actually is. The Buddha didn't leave us in the void. He pointed to freedom. Not the kind you buy or earn, but the kind you uncover once the illusion of me crumbles. And here's the secret. When there's no you to protect, love flows easier. Kindness doesn't need a reason. Forgiveness stops asking for justice. And awareness, stripped of ego, simply rests in itself. So, if no one is behind the curtain, what happens next? Let's follow the trail to where this illusion comes from, and how exactly experience gets forged into a me. It's a chain reaction most of us are caught in, without even realizing it. There's a moment when the mind becomes still, not because you forced it into silence, but because it realizes there is no one left to do the thinking. No observer, no controller, just awareness, pure and boundless. Jiddu Krishnamurti, one of the most radical spiritual thinkers of the 20th century, often stunned audiences with a statement that seems paradoxical. The observer is the observed. At first glance, it sounds cryptic. What does it mean? Let's slow down and feel it, not just analyze it. We tend to assume that there's a thinker inside our head, someone separate from the thoughts, judging, watching, controlling. But what Krishnamurti pointed out, aligning deeply with Buddhist wisdom, is that this separation is illusory. The very act of observing creates the idea of an observer. But when observation happens without naming, without judging, without dividing, something extraordinary is revealed. There is just awareness, no center, no controller, no observer, just seeing. Let's bring this to life. Imagine you're watching a sunset. Your mind is quiet. You're not thinking, this is a beautiful sunset, I like it, I should take a photo. You're simply looking. The moment is vibrant, alive, wordless. In that timeless space, there is no you enjoying the sunset. There is only the sunset and the awareness of it, inseparable, undivided. That is awareness without an observer. In Buddhism, particularly in the practice of Vipassana or insight meditation, practitioners are trained to observe sensations, thoughts, emotions, but not as a self experiencing them. The instruction is not to think about pain, pleasure, or fear, but to notice them as passing phenomena, just sensations, just thoughts, just feelings, appearing and disappearing in awareness. And here's the key. When you observe without identification, without trying to push or pull, the illusion of a separate self begins to dissolve. What's left? Not emptiness in the bleak sense, but a spacious, luminous awareness that's free from clinging. It's like the sky, always there, unaffected by the storms that pass through it. This is what Zen calls no mind, and it's not unconsciousness. In fact, it's the opposite. It's total alertness without tension. The kind of clear presence that doesn't belong to me or you, it just is. Krishnamurti warned us, the moment you name it, you kill it, because the naming is the return of the self, the observer. That's why silence is so crucial, not just the outer silence, but inner stillness. That's where true insight emerges, not from thought, but from attention. Now, many people feel unsettled by this. If there's no observer, then who's living this life? But perhaps that's the wrong question, because life is not being lived by someone, it's simply unfolding. Like a river flowing, a bird flying, a tree swaying in the wind. No controller, no owner, just life expressing itself. And in that realization, there's great peace. Because the one who suffers, the inner commentator, the self-image, the controller, is gone. What remains is awareness, quiet, infinite, free. This is not theory. You don't need to believe it. You can see it directly, any moment you drop the mental chatter and simply look. Look, not as someone observing, but as awareness itself. There is no need to search for truth. When there is no observer, truth is what remains. And this is where we now stand, on the edge of a deeper realization, one that Buddhism and Krishnamurti both hint toward, that the end of suffering is not the improvement of the self, but the ending of the illusion that there ever was one. From here, let us move into a deeper layer, not just seeing that there is no self, but understanding how this illusion arises moment by moment. There's a moment, quiet, still, unremarkable, when a person sitting in meditation notices the breath not just as a concept, but as a vivid, living experience. That's the threshold. That's when mindfulness stops being a word and starts becoming a doorway. To understand the wisdom of the Buddha, especially in the context of self and non-self, we must understand Vipassana. This isn't about religious rituals or abstract philosophy. It's about turning the mind into a mirror that reflects reality exactly as it is, not as we wish it to be. The Pali word Vipassana literally means clear seeing or insight, and it's often paired with sati, mindfulness. But this pairing is deeper than it appears. Sati is the ever-present attentiveness to what's happening in the now. Vipassana is the penetrative clarity that reveals why it's happening and what lies beneath. Imagine sitting in meditation. You feel a twitch in your shoulder. Ordinarily, you'd adjust or scratch without thinking. But with mindfulness, you simply notice tingling, warmth, tightness. And you don't move. Instead, you investigate. What begins as a small sensation unfolds into a series of revelations. The discomfort arises, you label it. Then comes the aversion. I don't like this. That aversion spins into a subtle tension in the mind, a pushing away energy. But the moment you see it clearly, this is aversion, something incredible happens. It loosens. In this tiny moment, the process of ego construction reveals itself. This is the beauty of Vipassana. It isn't about making something happen. It's about stopping the interference, like removing the ripples on a lake so the water reflects the sky. The more still the mind becomes, the more clearly we see not just the contents of consciousness, but the structure of consciousness itself. And what we begin to see is unsettling, liberating, and life-changing. There is no thinker behind the thoughts, no feeler behind the feelings, no one who suffers, only suffering arising and passing away. This is not just poetic metaphor, it's the direct observation of how things truly are. In traditional Vipassana, as taught by Mahasi Sayadaw or S.N. Gonka, practitioners observe the arising and passing away of bodily sensations, thoughts, emotions, and mental reactions. The The practice reveals not only anicca, impermanence, but also anatta, non-self. Why is this important? Because the mind, left unchecked, creates stories. This pain is happening to me. I am bored. I should be doing better at this. But mindfulness and insight allow us to break these links in the chain of suffering. You begin to witness experience not as my experience, but simply as unfolding phenomena in nature. A thought arises. It stays. It fades. A pain arises. It intensifies. It vanishes. A memory surfaces. It spins emotions. Then it too dissolves. And in each of these cases, something remarkable happens when you just watch instead of interfere. The illusion of self, of control, ownership, identity, begins to erode. This doesn't mean you lose your personality or your memories. It means you stop taking them so personally. You realize the you've been defending, chasing, improving, and worrying about is just a constellation of impermanent processes. And in that realization, there's space. Space for stillness, for wisdom, for freedom. Even neuroscience has begun catching up. Brain scans of seasoned meditators show that areas associated with the default mode network, the part of the brain linked to self-referential thinking, quiet down during deep mindfulness. That incessant hum of me begins to soften. And in that quiet, something deeper emerges. Not another identity, but something prior to identity. Pure, open awareness. This is the promise of Vipassana. It's not about bliss. It's not about escaping the world. It's about seeing reality with such clarity that your suffering no longer has a. The moment we open our eyes in the morning, a familiar narrative kicks in. I need coffee. I have to finish that project. Why did she say that to me yesterday? And just like that, we're back in the loop. An endless thread of thoughts all tied to one invisible anchor, the sense of self. But why are we so deeply invested in maintaining this me? Why do we cling to a fragile construction of identity, even when it causes so much suffering? The answer lies deep in the architecture of our mind. You see, the brain is a survival machine. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's been trained over millennia to identify threats, predict outcomes, and most of all, preserve what it believes to be you. The idea of I becomes the organizing principle around which it filters the world. Without this organizing center, the brain fears chaos, and so it builds the illusion of a permanent self, out of memory, desires, judgments, fears, roles, and labels, and then fights tooth and nail to defend it. But this self isn't solid, it's not fixed, it's a story. And stories, no matter how convincing, are not reality. So what keeps the story going? Craving and fear. Craving tells us, I need this to complete me. Fear warns, if I lose this, I won't know who I am. It's the craving for permanence in a world that is constantly shifting, the fear of losing identity in a sea of change. And so we cling to possessions, to opinions, to status, to relationships, hoping they will validate that we are someone. But just like grabbing onto clouds, the tighter we hold, the more suffering we invite. In Buddhist psychology, this is known as upadana, the act of clinging or grasping. The Buddha taught that this clinging is one of the root causes of dukkha, or suffering. But what makes the teaching revolutionary is not the diagnosis, it's the cure. To unhook from the illusion of self, we don't need to destroy anything. We simply need to observe, with clarity, without judgment, without interference. This is where mindfulness becomes not just a practice, but a liberating insight. When we sit and observe thoughts arise and pass away, emotions build and dissolve, sensations flicker like candlelight, we start to realize, none of this is me, none of it is permanent. There is awareness, yes, but no fixed person controlling the show. And here's the liberating part. If you are not your thoughts, you don't have to believe everything they say. If you are not your emotions, you don't have to be ruled by every feeling. If you are not your story, then your past does not define your future. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine you're standing in a river. The current pulls at your legs, trying to carry you away. Most of us spend our entire lives trying to resist that flow, fighting the change, resisting loss, holding on to passing moments, desperately trying to carve permanence in impermanence. But now, what if you stepped out of the river? What if, instead of struggling, you simply watched the current flow, not with indifference, but with deep understanding, with compassion, with wisdom, with the unshakable knowing, this too is not me. This stepping out is not escapism, it's clarity, it's freedom. And this freedom isn't about becoming something new. It's about remembering who you truly are beneath all the layers, awareness itself, open, luminous, untouched. But even as we begin to unhook from the story of self, there's one more trap that often catches us. The subtle ego that says, now I am awakening, I am more spiritual, I am letting go of the self. But who is this I again? This is the final knot. The illusion trying to protect itself even in its own unraveling. To see this clearly, to unhook from even the clinging to not self, requires a deeper seeing, a radical surrender, a silence so complete it allows truth to echo. And that silence, that inner spaciousness, is where we're headed. Something miraculous begins to happen when the illusion of self fades, not with a bang, but like mist lifting off a morning lake. You don't vanish. You don't become a lifeless void. In fact, something far more extraordinary begins to emerge. Compassion. Not the forced, moral kind we're told to practice out of duty, but a compassion that flows like a river from the recognition that there is no true separation between you and anyone else. The dissolving of the self isn't an intellectual trick or a trance-like state. It's an experiential shift where the boundaries you've always protected, this is me, that is you, begin to blur. You still function, you still speak, but the tight grip of I, me, mine loosens. And in that loosening, you begin to feel the weight others carry not as their burden alone, but as something deeply shared. Have you ever watched someone cry, not with judgment or pity, but with the unfiltered sense that their pain is your pain, that their longing is your longing? That's the compassion born of non-self. It doesn't arise because you're trying to be kind. It arises because you no longer see a line between your heart and theirs. The Buddha once said, "When you see yourself in others, who can you harm? What can you fear?" That's the essence of this chapter. As long as there's a solid self, compassion is conditional. We help others when it fits our story, when it doesn't cost us too much, when we feel safe, when we feel superior. But when the self dissolves, that entire framework crumbles. There's no more cost-benefit analysis, no more choosing sides. The pain of another pierces you not as an attack, but as a calling. This is why so many enlightened beings speak not of indifference, but of overwhelming love. They aren't detached robots. They're profoundly present. Their eyes see clearly because they no longer need to protect a fictional ego. And so, they hold others with infinite patience and warmth, not because they're saints, but because they've seen through the illusion of separation. It's not just compassion for people either. Trees, birds, the earth itself, they're not out there anymore. You begin to feel a tenderness for all life, not as a poetic concept, but as a natural response. The wind on your skin is no longer external. The dog barking in the distance is not a distraction. All of it becomes part of a single, living field of awareness, and your role in it. Not the center, not the star, just a witness, a presence, a pulse in the great dance of being. But let's be clear, getting to this point isn't about killing the ego or transcending the self by sheer willpower. That's just another game the self plays, trying to defeat itself to prove it's enlightened. No, this path is about softening, about watching the self with such tenderness, such sustained awareness that it begins to unravel naturally. Like a knot loosening not by force but by careful hands. And when the knot finally slips, when the idea of a separate me no longer dictates every move, you don't disappear. You become wide open, receptive, free. And into that openness flows the world, not as an object to conquer, but as something you now are. That is the seed of true compassion, not manufactured, not moralized, but inevitable. What if the peace you've been chasing doesn't need to be earned, created, or controlled at all? What if it's already here, silently present, patiently waiting beneath all the mental noise, the emotional storms, and the ceaseless striving of the self? You see, the more we try to control life, the more it controls us. We spend our days arranging and rearranging the furniture of existence, hoping that once everything is in the right place, the right job, the right body, the right partner, the right mood, then, and only then, we can finally rest. But have you ever noticed that even when things go your way, the peace is fleeting? Something in the mind always wants more, fears loss, or doubts what it already has. That's because control is not peace. Control is fear wearing the mask of order. The Buddha pointed to a peace far deeper than anything conditional. He called it nibbana, not a place, not a trance, but a freedom from clinging. It's not about having no feelings or living in a cave. It's about being intimate with reality as it is, without needing it to be different. When the sense of I softens, when we no longer cling to the story of who we are or how things must go, a remarkable thing happens. We begin to rest effortlessly, not because the world is perfect, but because we are no longer at war with it. This peace isn't passive. It's not apathy or resignation. It's alive. It's radiant. It's that quiet confidence in a tree that bends with the wind, not because it's weak, but because it's rooted. Krishnamurti once said, "To be free of psychological effort is the greatest revolution." And this is what the Dharma invites us into, a revolution of stillness, a radical act of letting be. In Vipassana meditation, this peace reveals itself in the simplest moments. A breath fully known, a sensation clearly felt, a thought seen and released, not controlled, not judged, just known. And in that knowing, there is no self doing the knowing. There is only knowing itself. This is not something to achieve. It's what remains when the achieving stops. When you no longer need to become anyone, you finally discover the freedom of being no one. And in that being, everything is enough. The peace we speak of here doesn't arrive with trumpets or fireworks. It arrives like morning mist, soft, gentle, unnoticed by the mind that always seeks drama. It's a peace that needs no control, because it never belonged to the controller in the first place. You don't need to do anything to earn it. You just need to stop doing what takes you away from it. Let go of the chase, the grasp, the fixing, and simply rest in what is. There comes a moment in one's spiritual journey that feels like standing at the edge of a vast, silent ocean. There is no wind, no movement, just stillness. And in that stillness, something profound happens. The voice inside that once shouted me, mine, I want begins to grow quiet, not because it was silenced, but because it no longer feels necessary. It simply has no audience anymore. The observer that once narrated your every experience dissolves into the very awareness that held it all. And with that soft fading away, love begins. Not love as desire or attachment, not love as a role or a mask, but a gentle, unwavering openness, a presence that says, I see you, I am you. This is not poetic sentiment, it is lived experience. When the illusion of separation falls away, we no longer look at others through the veil of judgment or fear. There's no more guarding, no more pretending, no more needing to prove or defend anything. because there is no one left to defend. Just this, a quiet, unconditional tenderness. Compassion ceases to be an effort, it becomes who we are. Every encounter, every face, every breath becomes a sacred opportunity to meet the world not from the story of me, but from the stillness of presence. In this place, there is no urgency to fix yourself, no anxiety to become someone else, no race to attain spiritual milestones. The journey has always been about unbecoming, unraveling the layers that covered what was already whole. This is the great gift of Buddhist insight, not merely to escape suffering, but to see through the very one who suffers. And when that vision becomes clear, life becomes simple. We respond rather than react. We connect rather than control. We listen rather than label. We love just because we can. No story is needed. No self is required. Just the pure, boundless awareness that knows. This moment is enough. And you, dear listener, are already home. If this journey touched something quiet within you, if it whispered to a truth you've always sensed but never had words for, then you're not alone. You're exactly where you're meant to be. For more teachings that guide you beyond thought and into presence, we invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we don't offer beliefs, we offer stillness. Not answers, but the space to meet the mystery as it is. Thank you for walking this path with us. May you rest deeply in what you already are.